Thank you all for coming to this evening's event. My name is Kim Sutton. I'm the Chief Customer Officer at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I wanted to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual author events by visiting powells.com. Please consider following us on social media as well, on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. As well, if you haven't done so already, please sign up for our weekly events email at powells.com. Tonight, we are honored to welcome David Sheff, Jarvis Jay Masters, and Rebecca Solnit. David Sheff is the author of multiple books, including the number one New York Times best-selling memoir, Beautiful Boy, which was recently turned into a movie starring Steve Carell and Timothée Chalamet. Sheff's work has appeared in the New York Times, Outside, Rolling Stone, Wired, Fortune, and elsewhere. His piece for the New York Times, My Addicted Son, received an award from the American Psychological Association for outstanding contribution to advancing the understanding of addiction. Sheff's new book, The Buddhist on Death Row, explores the transformation of Jarvis Jay Masters, who has become one of America's most inspiring Buddhist practitioners while locked in a cell on death row. Masters entered San Quentin State Prison in 1981 and has been on death row since 1990, where he spent over 21 years in solitary confinement. The author of Finding Freedom, How Death Row Broke and Opened My Heart, and That Bird Has Wings, the autobiography of an innocent man on death row, as well as numerous articles. Masters won a PEN Award in 1992 for his poem, Recipe for Prison, Pruno.
Oh, right.
Sheff is also joined this evening in conversation by Rebecca Solnit, writer, historian, and activist. Solnit is the author of more than 20 books on feminism, Western and urban history, popular power, social change, and insurrection, Wandering and Walking, Hope and Catastrophe. Her books include Recollections of My Nonexistence, Hope in the Dark, and Men Explain Things to Me. A product of the California public education system from kindergarten to graduate school, she writes regularly for The Guardian and LitHub and serves on the board of the climate group Oil Change International. Jarvis Jay Masters will also join us halfway through the event. Because he is calling in from San Quentin, we ask for your patience as we deal with the technical component. As Rebecca said and David said, Masters will likely be disconnected a couple of times and may have to call back in, but we look forward to welcoming him into the discussion. This evening's event will also include an audience Q&A, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question that you're interested in hearing the answer to, please upvote the question by clicking on the thumbs up. Most importantly, please consider supporting both David and Powell's by purchasing a copy of The Buddhist on Death Row. A link to purchase the book, as well as Masters and Solnit's books, will be shared in the chat this evening. David, Rebecca, it's an honor to welcome you both tonight. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kim.
Wonderful to be here. David, should we chat a bit, or did you want to go straight into your reading? I think it might be a good place to start because it sets up so much of what people need to know about Jarvis to have this conversation between us and with him.
Well, sure. And Rebecca, thank you so much for doing this. As Kim said, Jarvis is on death row. He shouldn't be on death row. He was framed for a crime, and his appeals are going through, and we're very hopeful. There's a whole group of us, friends, supporters, who are working for his exoneration. And now that his appeal goes to the federal court with a new team of lawyers, we're hopeful. But indeed, Jarvis, about 35 years ago, entered San Quentin when he was only 19 years old. And as this young man was told when a guard was killed, was told basically that he couldn't defend himself or he would have been killed. And so he was found guilty and he was sentenced to death. And he's been on death row since then. The day after he received the death sentence, Jarvis that night heard footsteps and then pounding. He looked up into the blinding beams of flashlights held by guards, one of whom told him to step up to the bars. Jarvis thought they were there to kill him. Mob justice, a lynching. Shielding his eyes with his hands, trembling, he rose and stumbled forward. "We have to read this," a guard snapped. "You have to sign it." They weren't there to kill him after all, but to carry out the mandatory reading of the execution order. Jarvis signed the piece of paper that condemned him to die. The next morning, breakfast was delivered as usual, and the day progressed as if nothing had changed. Also as usual, the mail was delivered in the evening. Jarvis examined a large envelope from someone named Lisa Leghorn, who in a note explained that she was an assistant interpreter to Shagdud Tilku Rinpoche, who was a Buddhist Lama that Jarvis had written to months before. She said that she had sent him a pamphlet entitled "Life in Relation to Death," which contained a transcript of a talk by the Lama. "Read it," she said, "and see if it speaks to you." Jarvis picked up the book and was instantly transfixed. On the first page, the Lama described death as a subject people often ignore or think about frivolously, as if it were no big deal. Then the author wrote, "This is a nice theory until one is dying. Then experience and theory differ." He continued, "Then one is powerless and everything familiar is lost. One is overwhelmed by a great turbulence of fear, disorientation, and confusion. For this reason, it is essential to prepare well in advance for the moment when the mind and the body separate." Jarvis read all night. Dawn was breaking as he turned the final page, but he was wide awake. He didn't believe in omens, but he reeled at the thought that during his first day on death row, the mail had brought him a guide to dying. Jarvis responded to the Rinpoche and the translator, thanking him for the package and explaining what had happened since he'd first written, that he'd been convicted, sentenced to death. He told them he was trying to get his mind around the sentence and admitted that he was afraid. Prison mail was slow, and it took a month for him to hear back from the Lama, who said he understood Jarvis's confusion and fear, but assured him that he was fortunate in his situation was a gift. "You can use your circumstances for your betterment and to benefit others," he said. The thought appalled Jarvis. Being on death row was no gift. The Lama wrote that all people have been sentenced to death, and that way Jarvis wasn't unique. And that idea angered Jarvis too. Yes, he thought, everyone is going to die, but not everyone is living 100 yards from the site of their execution. "We all live in a prison, and we all hold the key," the Rinpoche wrote. More patronizing bullshit, Jarvis thought. "You do not live in a prison. I live in a prison. You may have a key, but the keys to my cell are hanging off the jailer's belts." Jarvis's anger diminished when the Lama offered concrete instructions. Stick with meditation because it allows us to gain insight into our own mind and its projections. Fear is in your mind. Regret is in your mind. The key, the teacher said, was practice. Jarvis should meditate at least twice a day, even when it was difficult. He should allow himself to feel doubt, confusion, anger, and fear. Jarvis tried to follow the Lama's instructions, but his despair only worsened over the following months. In a letter to the Lama, Jarvis admitted that he was falling into the darkest place and didn't know if he was going to be able to pull himself out. In her response, Lisa said that she and the Rinpoche understood his despair and difficulty of meditating in that state, but she said, "Yes, it's hard, but it can save you. Meditation is hardest when we're most afraid because it forces us to face our fears when we all want to do is run from them. But it's the only way out of our misery." "It's hard to see where you are," she acknowledged, "but it's like walking from one mountain to another. If you think about how far you have to go, you'll freeze up and never take the first step. Just take the first step." He broached something that had been gnawing at him. "In these books, I see pictures of Buddhists sitting in robes on mountain peaks, chanting in these gardens with white flowers and blue skies. Maybe that works there, but how in the world am I going to sit in this hellhole praying to some stone fat man? I live with rapists and killers. Everyone talks enlightenment, living in the light, but I live in hell." Lisa responded with a parable about a woman named Kisa Gautame who lived at the time of the Buddha. Her son died and she was overcome with grief. Carrying his lifeless body, she set in search of the Buddha. After many days, she found him and pled with him to bring her child back to life. The Buddha said he'd make medicine that would revive him, but it required a special ingredient, mustard seeds that came from a home that hadn't been touched by suffering, and he sent her out to find them. She went from village to village and house to house, knocking on door after door. People pitied her and were happy to help, but the seeds they offered were useless because every person she met had suffered. She was desperate, and she reached out finally to the 1,000th door. She knocked, and a woman answered. Once again, she begged for mustard seeds. The woman had some, but then Kisa Gotami asked if she'd experienced suffering in her life. The woman looked up at her. Her life had been filled with suffering. Kisa Gotami wept. She wasn't crying for herself, but for everyone she'd met. She understood at last what the Buddha had wanted her to see, that no one escapes suffering and no one escapes death. She had experienced what she needed in order to get past her grief. She felt compassion for others. And in that instant, she felt that compassion. She grasped the universality of suffering and the impermanence of life. She accepted her son's death, and she was freed from her pain. She became awakened as a person who grasped the true nature of existence. That night, Jarvis lay in his cot, listening to the prison's unceasing noise, sobs like crying wind, coughing, hacking, the footsteps of guards. After having been unable to meditate for months, he moved to the floor, crossed his legs, and sat erect. He inhaled as deeply as he ever had. In a dreamlike state, he saw a man sitting in meditation, his body engulfed in flames. He focused on the meditator and recognized him. The man was himself. As if he were watching through a reverse telephoto lens, he panned back from inside his cell to the tier. Somehow he saw inside the other cells, each containing a man who was also on fire. He zoomed out more and saw San Quentin from the sky. From that vantage, he saw several thousand burning bodies. Still higher from the clouds, still higher, he saw California, which was also engulfed in flames. He saw the continent, the Western Hemisphere. Next, he was watching from space. From that height, he saw the whole planet floating in blackness. The water was blue, the land masses were brown and green. On those expanses, wherever there were humans, fires burned. Jarvis returned to the prison, to the thousands of men in cages unfit for animals. He thought of Kisa Gotami and realized that suffering was all around him, everywhere humans were. When he opened his eyes, he was shaking, and tears were streaming down his cheeks.
Wow. Where should we start, David? Should we start about what prompted you to write this book and how your sense of Jarvis changed? You started out as a skeptic, didn't you?
I did. I had a friend a couple of friends actually, who knew Jarvis and talked about him, and they spoke about him as this, first of all, as this innocent man in death row. And then they spoke about him as this remarkable person who had affected their lives in dramatic ways, who had become a writer, had taught others Buddhism in prison, and it had made a huge impact on the lives of people in prison, and including both inmates and guards. And yeah, I was skeptical. I thought it sounded great, but I also wondered if these friends of mine, who were these very open, kind, generous people, were somehow being manipulated.
Yeah.
So I did the investigation, both into his case and both into his personal story, and I went to see him. And in both cases, I was convinced 100% he is innocent, he shouldn't be there, and he really is a remarkable person who has changed lives.
How did you tell them you wanted to write a book about him?
I arranged to see him. At first, he didn't want to see me or anyone at that time. A mutual friend convinced him. I went in to see him, and going into death row, Rebecca, as you know, having visited Jarvis, it is overwhelming, it is ghastly, it is terrifying. And Jarvis came out, this man sitting across from me, and his reading glasses around his neck, and he started joking with me right away. He's got this amazing sense of humor. And I told him what I wanted to do. And when I said that I wanted to write his story, and if I did write his story as a journalist, I would be writing what I found, the good and the bad. I'll never forget what he said, which is, you can't picture me any worse than I've been pictured. Look where I am on death row. And that began a process of years and years, about 5 years. Originally, I told Jarvis it was going to take 1.5 years to complete the interviews. And Jarvis bet me that wasn't going to be the case, and he won the bet. It's been 5 years since then.
His sense of humor. One of the things that really came back to me reading your book was, I talk to him on the phone pretty regularly. He is extremely funny. We banter a lot. We laugh a lot. That it was really easy for me to lose sight of how grim his circumstances are. And he will say things. I have visited him in the death row visiting situation, which maybe we should describe. And one of the things that's just remarkable about him for me is how he's created a self and a life. It's not as though it doesn't matter that he's on death row, but he's found forms of freedom, forms of connection, forms of being in the world with a Buddhist Sangha, the Rinpoche who became his teacher, a lot of strong friendships, 3 books written to date, and all this other stuff. And yet at the same time, he lives surrounded by child rapists and murderers, and as a man living in something the size of a Marin County small walk-in closet, all day, every day, terrible food and terrible violence all around him and more.
Yeah, and I guess the thing that really strikes me is how he says this. He talks about people on death row and lifers who've been in there for as long as he's been in. And there aren't that many choices. He said many of the people become very bitter and angry, isolated, of course, and some become addicted. And there are a lot of suicides on death row. But Jarvis, he chose to go a different way. And the reason that he can sort of exude that positive outlook and energy, even in this place that is hell, is because he always says how lucky he is. And when I heard him say that, I thought, how can this man say he's lucky? He was convicted of a murder he didn't commit. He spent his life in prison. And he said, when I asked him that, he said, look at the people around me. There are 700 people on death row, 700 men in San Quentin. He said, most of them don't get any visitors, even their lawyers, over the course of a year. They are sick, they're infirmed, they are isolated. And he said that I just feel so blessed and so lucky. And the idea that he could, take from that, this sort of understanding, this compassion about the people that were around him, and realize that even in that circumstance, he feels very lucky. And I feel like, I talked to some people on death row, including someone who knew Jarvis, who was also on death row for about 3 decades. And he said that, that Jarvis sort of lives that talk, which is when he's out in the yard, he's connecting with people. If he notices someone who is new to the prison, it's obviously a very scary place to be. Jarvis will go up and engage the person, and he just does what he can to help people. This guy himself was addicted to heroin and other drugs, and Jarvis, one day a book showed up in his cell, and Jarvis had asked one of his friends to send him the Buddhist 12 steps. And then Jarvis said to him, we're going to do this together. And Jarvis worked with him on those 12 steps, and the guy credits Jarvis for saving his life.
Do you want to tell some of the other stories? Because one of the things that's remarkable about him is that not only did he transform himself, but that he's really transformed a lot of other lives inside the prison and out. You tell some amazing stories in the book about that. And also, everybody, Jarvis is going to call in. We're going to take that call, and we will stop doing whatever we're doing, and we will all go along on a ride with the California State Prison phone system, wherever it takes us. But in the meantime, David.
I'm a little worried because Jarvis, the way it works in the prison, as you know, Rebecca, is the inmate has to request the phone at a certain time. If it's approved, a cart comes down the tier, a guard brings a cart, they put the phone in the, I don't know what you call it, where they serve their food, a little slot.
Yeah.
And they stopped doing that for a while because of COVID, of course, but then they reinstated the phone calls, and Jarvis requested and had permission to use the phone now. But he also told me that this happened the other day, and it may not be happening now, but because there's so many guards who are not working because of COVID, and because of there have been people protesting in front of San Quentin. So a lot of the guards have been just charged with overseeing that. And he said there's always a chance that there won't be a guard that is going to be bringing him the phone. So I guess we just have to hope that he'll show up. And I have faith that he will. And but I hope so. And if he doesn't, if he can't, or even the struggle to get it, just as a reminder to us of what his life is like.
So is he overdue to call in?
Yeah, just he was going to call in at any minute. So
Okay, well,
usually pretty prompt. So, but until he does, I'll tell you very quickly a couple stories. There was a remarkable story about this man who was a young man. He was actually a kid, really, and he was gay. And in prison, there is a culture and a code that, in some cases, that's not okay. And this kid was vulnerable to be killed. And Jarvis saw that these guys were approaching him and knew that they had a knife up their sleeve and that this guy was going to be killed. And Jarvis went up to those men, and he, instead of doing what would have been maybe the obvious thing, but also a thing that would be unacceptable probably in prison on the yard like that, just to say, you guys can't do this. He said something that I don't even think he was conscious of the fact that it was really a Buddhist way of thinking and intervening and taking an action. But I think it was. He went up to them and he started to talk about them. And he said, "Do you see that guy over, that kid, that boy, who's gay? Think about his life. He lived like we lived. He suffered. He suffered because he was gay. He suffered because he grew up he grew up poor. He had been violently treated, and he was growing up. He'd been beat. And he said, and in this place, because he's this gay man, he's a sheep. He's like a sheep, and the wolves are going to prey on the sheep. And we have the opportunity to protect the sheep from the wolves." And so it wasn't just about saving this kid's life. It was giving these men this power, this sort of empowerment to really start to think differently for themselves and just think with some compassion. And it was pretty extraordinary. And the only other thing, I guess, the other one I'll tell quickly, there's a lot of stories, but the only one I'll tell very quickly, because it is even more extraordinary to me that Jarvis can have an impact on fellow inmates, fellow prisoners on death row. It's a guard who talked to me, and it was the guard talked to me only off the record, and he was very, very nervous because he felt that to say something positive about a prisoner and the culture in which he lived could have been dangerous for him. But he told me about a period of his life when he was struggling, when he was depressed, when he was he said his father was violent and an alcoholic, and he said he was drinking a lot, and he hadn't actually been violent to his children, but he was afraid that's where he was going, and he actually thought about killing himself. And Jarvis, who'd seen the guy for years, they'd never spoken more than a few words, called the guard over in the middle of the night and said, "Hey, how you doing? You seem like something's wrong." And the guy said he's not the kind of person that was ever going to open up about his personal life to anyone, but especially a prisoner. But there was something about Jarvis's presence there that he told him what was going on, and it began a conversation that continued over weeks and eventually months. And the guy said that everything changed in his life because of those conversations. Not only did he understand sort of he became grateful for the life he had, grateful for his children, grateful for the opportunity to give his life, give his kids a life that people like Jarvis had not been able to have. But the other thing that was sort of extraordinary for me is the guy hated his job. He said it was like, he treated prisoners as if they were cattle, and that's how he thought of them. But Jarvis, in talking to him, made him realize that he was he had an opportunity to help people who had terribly difficult lives and were in prison, whether they were guilty or innocent of their crime. They were suffering, and he could help them, even if it was a little bit. And the man told me that his job, he started to look forward to coming to work, and he felt that he could make a difference in the lives of people.
One of the things that was remarkable, because we did a version of this conversation with a San Francisco organization, was when Jarvis was asked by somebody who I think had done time themselves, why should I be compassionate towards a guard, or how can you possibly be compassionate towards a guard? And Jarvis had this beautiful answer. He has this wonderful indirect way of kind of finding people where they're at and helping them imagine beyond the kind of obvious transaction. Mm-hmm. And he said, what you do to that guard, he may go home and take out on his kids. So think about those kids, and whatever you do, you can do for those kids. And I think that was partly his way of saying, yeah, maybe somebody can be compassionate directly towards the guard, but that's a lot to ask of a prisoner and a lot of other people. So here's an intermediate step to kind of get over just having pure animosity towards him.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great example of the way that he thinks.
Yeah, the indirectness too, where it wasn't like, here's how you should think, but like, here's a new pathway for your thoughts to travel, is so Jarvis. We got a first question that I think is really useful. Are we saying Jarvis is innocent of what sent him to San Quentin in the first place, or of the thing that put him on death row? And I wonder if you could talk about that, and about maybe why we believe he's innocent, and why the evidence all leans that way if you study it, as we both have.
Yeah, Jarvis is very open about the fact that he got to San Quentin because he committed a series of crimes when he was 17 years old, one crime after the other. And as a younger person, it was petty crimes, but it escalated to the point where he was committing violent. He was committing armed robberies. He tells the story about going into a Target store with a shotgun. He went into fast food restaurants and liquor stores, and there were a lot of robberies. And then one of the things that he says is the hardest thing for him to live with is the fact that he knows that in those situations he's traumatized people over and over and over again, and he's felt incredibly remorseful and has been looking with his Buddhist teachers about ways to atone for that. And actually, when his teacher Pema Chodron, he said that to her. He said, "But I don't even know the names of the people. It's not like I can write them letters." She said, "What you can do is, for the rest of your life, you can serve others in the name of the people that you hurt," which was this sort of beautiful thing. But anyway, so he was finally arrested after this crime spree, and he was sentenced, found guilty of 20 counts of armed robbery, and sentenced to San Quentin. And the sentence was 20 years, eligible parole, I forget, 15 years or something like that. He'd been in the prison for 5 years when a guard, his name was Sergeant Howell Birchfield, was murdered. Jarvis was one of 3 inmates who was charged with the murder. Jarvis was a very young kid, and he was very vulnerable in the prison at that time. And he was told in those uncertain terms, if he defended himself, basically he had to go up and accept the murder sentence, because he would have been killed himself. Sorry.
Yeah. You're clarifying just that, he had 2 forms of death penalty to face: the death penalty if he tried to exonerate himself, and the death penalty if he didn't.
Yeah, he was vulnerable at that point. San Quentin was a different place now. Now there are a lot of really conscientious corrections officers, and they really take their job, like that guy I was talking about, as a service. I mean, not all of them, of course, but a lot of them do. But that was a time I spoke to the warden, who was warden then, and that time San Quentin was a war zone. It was hell, and Jarvis was vulnerable to attack both by other inmates and by guards, by prisoners. So he was in pretty dire circumstances, and he was charged and he was convicted. The basis of the conviction, that is what we believe will ultimately get him out on his appeal, is that most of the reason that Jarvis was ultimately convicted was because of the testimony of other inmates, of snitches. They didn't disclose at the time, the prosecution didn't disclose at the time, that the prosecution had made deals with these guys. In one case, he was transferred to a safer and nicer part of the prison. In another case, he was threatened that if he didn't testify against Jarvis, he was going to be threatened to. He was a known informer, so he potentially could have been killed. All these examples. Since then, everyone who testified has recanted their testimony. Jarvis was convicted of killing another guard stabbed.
Another prisoner stabbed the guard.
Stabbed the guard. Jarvis was accused and convicted of making the knife. The inmate who actually made the knife confessed to another guard that he did it. So there's so much evidence, and the problem is, the criminal justice system, it's taken him now, it'll take 30 years. He recently lost his most recent appeal in California, but now there's new hope because he has a new legal team, a team of some of the great lawyers in the country that don't take pro bono cases unless they believe in the innocence of their client, and they've taken on Jarvis's case pro bono. So there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful.
Yeah, I told a constitutional law professor and a law journalist who his team was, and they were both like, it doesn't get any better than that. So I really hope to. I just want to interject while we still hope Jarvis can call in. I think a lot of us, especially my fellow white people out there, you see movies and read books and things where the clever lawyer or the clever prosecutor or defense or whatever finds, like, the case seems airtight, but there's one shoddy link in the chain of facts, and the clever person seizes on that one shoddy thing. Everything else looks really solid. And when you look at Jarvis's case, what's shocking is every single thing is shoddy. They threw out all the physical evidence, the physical possibility of the weapon having traveled from where Jarvis was to where the murder took place. The things, other people implicated said later, the corruption of the witnesses. And there's just such a sense that they just thought, okay, black guys murdered this white guard, black people should be punished. We don't really care who. Is not surprising if you pay attention more broadly, but in terms of the kind of crime narrative where we're used to, where actually most of it is done in a fairly professional manner, but there's one little twist. Like, everything in this case is rotten. It's really kind of shocking to look at in some ways.
It's shocking to me too, and I'm and again, I mean, we all hope Jarvis will be walking out of those doors, and we have to have faith that he will. But even then, to think about what was robbed from him the past, almost like you said, Rebecca, 40 years of his life. I mean, he would have been eligible for parole. I guess that would have been 25 to 30 years ago, and he recently turned
58.
58. And one of the problems with the fact that this was a crime that was committed inside the prison is that there isn't that physical evidence. As you said, Rebecca, the knife that was used to kill the guard disappeared. Where is it? It disappeared. And now there are new exonerations around the country, but most of them are exonerations because of DNA. So it becomes pretty black and white if a person is exonerated through DNA. But because this was in the prison 35 years ago, there is no DNA. So now it's really a question of stringing these pieces together, showing the flaws in the original case, and adding this new evidence about the recantations. People have said that Jarvis couldn't have been the person who did it because in the original trial transcripts, the person who made the knife was described looks nothing like Jarvis. The person who then confessed to having made the knife looks exactly like the guy who did make the knife.
Yeah, they made the facts fit, the story they wanted, and the whole thing. I talked, you got to know Jarvis through Pamela, and I got to know Jarvis through Melody Chavez's wonderful book, Altars in the Streets, about being a young woman who moves into West Berkeley as the crack era really ravages her new neighborhood. She discovers Buddhism and she becomes a death penalty investigator for the defense. And she just describes her own path to Buddhism and meeting Jarvis. When I decided I wanted to write about Jarvis for Harper's, I talked to her and she described, after the guard was murdered, everyone in the tiers realized that their cells would be searched. And there was, and the image has always been so graphic for me, that it rained weapons. Everyone had weapons in their cells. Everyone threw them out. They were all discarded. And the fact that they didn't even try and keep the murder weapon, is so much about just the sheer shoddiness of the whole system. And, and then the California Supreme Court verdict recently just was so shocking in how it was written, which was this kind of racist condemnation of him as a person rather than question of whether he was actually guilty of what he was charged with. Mm-hmm. That was also shocking. The part that stuck with me is the justice who wrote the opinion went on about how Jarvis allegedly took money out of another kid's pocket or something when he was 10 years old, because what we haven't mentioned yet, his mother was addicted and troubled. His father was nowhere to be seen. He was put into the foster care system, had a really wonderful set of foster parents who aged out of being able to care for him, and then was put in a lot of terrible places he ran away from. So he got put in the juvenile justice system. And for me, that was doubly shocking. First of all, because I don't think I know anybody who didn't like take money out of their mom's purse, or, like take some crayons home from school or some tiny thing like that when they were 10 or 6 or whatever. I know I did lots of it. But also there was no one there to record it. And, like 45 years later, you don't have someone saying you did something bad when you're 10 and it's going to count towards your death penalty. And one of the shocking moments when I visited him, the first time, is this white guy walked by, and Jarvis kind of yelled at him, and I was like, is that a friend or an enemy? I couldn't tell if they were bantering or kind of hating on each other. And he said, the two of us have known each other longer than anyone else. We were in foster care together, and it just kind of sent a knife through me, the sense that, oh my God, these men were being groomed for death row as children by being put into these other kind of really terrible institutions. And I know this is your book and you should talk, but I just want to put in one more context for the person and for everyone listening about how he ended up in prison, which was really that the foster care system was violently abusive. The juvenile justice system was violently abusive, and he kind of had no place to turn and no one to learn any better from. And he was really kind of a kid being used by an older man to commit these violent crimes. So yeah, he definitely has some responsibility, but he was 17 and 18. And I believe it was one of his uncle's friends who was really kind of masterminding these holdups and things.
Mm-hmm.
And they were terribly violent in that they were pointing guns and people were facing death, but nobody was actually, the gun was never fired, which doesn't make it okay, but makes it different than, some of the other ways that it could be.
Well, and it just emphasizes the injustice, and it also, Jarvis's background. We all know, Black Lives Matter. We're learning more and more. We saw the videotape, George Floyd, and we just, and it's so sad that it took that for us to have the kinds of conversations that are being had. But 1 out of every 3 Black men in America are going to end up in prison at some point in their life, which is a horrifying statistic. And Jarvis said that, when he was growing up, there's this guy named Jacques Verdun who runs the GRIP program in San Quentin, quotes one of the inmates that he's worked with, and he said, hurt people. And that sort of says it all. And Jarvis was hurt when he was a child from the beginning. He was violently beaten. He was afraid all the time that, he adored his mother, but his mother was addicted, and she'd be passed out, and he would be trying to wake her up, trying to open her eyes, terrified every time that she had died. As he went further into the system, he had a foster mother who threatened that if he ever told about how the foster parents were treating the foster kids, she took his hand and she put it into a garbage disposal and turned it on. And she didn't put it in the blades, but she said that she would if he ever told. Older in another institution, the guards would bet on the kids, whoever they would burn the kids with cigarettes, and whichever kid pulled their arm away first would be beaten. They made kids fight each other. I mean, one thing, it's not, violence, hurt people. Which all goes back to, I guess, sort of it just brings us back to this remarkable life that he's had, because, I just cannot imagine what he went through. And then he arrived in San Quentin, and he did say that he went onto the yard, and the first time and he looked around and he saw people that he knew from throughout his life at different points in his life in the various jails and institutions he'd been in. And it was just a moment of recognition. He said it was like we all had the same parents.
Yeah. I'm looking at some of the questions we have. Actually, my friend Joe Lamb asks, does Jarvis have a Sangha inside San Quentin? Do you know?
Yeah, he does. I mean, he has. I met Jarvis through his Sangha that is outside of San Quentin, and I think Rebecca is part of it, and Pamela Krasny, who is the one who introduced me, is part of it, and Pema Chodron is the one who introduced Pamela Krasny. So he has this lovely group of supporters. Alan Senaki, the abbot from the Berkeley Zen Center, is a dear friend and also someone who works with him. But inside the prison, there is this group of people that have been, in a sense, saved because Jarvis has introduced them to Buddhism. Because one of the basic tenets of Buddhism is about, first of all, it's all about trying to be to learn how to live in the moment. And if you're in prison, the past and the future are not where you want to be. You want to be in the moment as much as you can. And so that part of Buddhism. But then the other part goes back to that story that teacher told Jarvis about the woman who was trying to went to 1,000 doors to try to find somebody who had not suffered. And so the idea of Buddhism, it's sort of like we are all in this pool of suffering. And so the idea of connecting to one another, I think, is very, very powerful. And Jarvis, for a while, was able to actually conduct with a chaplain in the prison a weekly. It was a former shower that they converted into a chapel, and he was able to talk about Buddhism, teach meditation, tell Buddhist stories, and a guy who actually, miraculously, one of Jarvis's oldest friends from San Quentin, his name is Freddie Taylor, he actually got out last year after that amount of time. And Freddie Taylor told me that Jarvis's instruction into Buddhism really did save him as well. Because first of all, Jarvis's, it was not, I'm going to lay this on you. It was like, we are in trouble. That's the way he said it. We are in trouble, and we are in a place that we have to figure out a way to survive. And this is what's helped me. And he shared it. And he said that the way that Jarvis said we made all the difference for him, because it wasn't like this great, Lama bestowing wisdom. It was that we're going to do this together, and and there's a lot of examples of that.
Here's a really good question from someone anonymous. Can you talk about how your experience writing this story and spending so much time with Masters has impacted your life?
But yeah, I went in, as I said earlier, kind of cynical about the case and about this idea of transforming as a can people really change? I guess that was sort of the question there. And he did, and I saw he did over the course of his decades in San Quentin. But what I didn't expect was for me to change, and I have in some very unexpected and profound ways. One of them is sort of this simple message that I got from him. Jarvis tells the story about he was sick. I don't know if it was 15 years ago. He had an ear problem, and they couldn't fix it in the prison hospital, so they drove him to Marin General Hospital in a prison van, and he was in the back, and the van got stuck in traffic, and the guards were really pissed off, and they were, oh God, we're going to be sitting here for hours. Jarvis was thrilled because he was out of the prison. He was looking out the windows. He saw, the sunlight, the people walking by the sidewalks. And then he said that he started to look inside the cars. And he said that it brought tears to his eyes because he saw just all these beautiful people. And he said that, he didn't know their stories, but they all had a story. And I was going to San Francisco airport and doing what I often do, which is running, going, sort of feeling like everything I'm doing is so important. And if I miss my flight, I'm going to miss my meetings, and it's going to be a disaster. And oh my God. And I was stuck on the Golden Gate Bridge in traffic. And I was really pissed off. I was starting to call the airline to see what I was going to do. And then I thought of Jarvis's story. And so I stopped for a minute, and I did what Jarvis did. And I looked around at all the other cars that were stopped. And I saw what he saw. I saw through his eyes. And I saw these people that were, every one of them, sort of extraordinary. And there was, this man next to me, and he looked like he'd been through a lot in his life. And I imagined, did he have children? What was his story? There was, people on cell phones. Were they talking to, were they doing business? Are these people happy? Are they suffering? It's so, I guess, simple and obvious, but I never, ever would have paid attention if not for that. And the other thing I'll say just very, very quickly that really had a profound impact on me is I've spent a lot of time because, you mentioned, or Kim mentioned at the beginning, that I wrote a book called Beautiful Boy about my family when my son became addicted to drugs and almost died. And after that book was written, That's not Jarvis. Unfortunately, it's the wrong line. After that book was written, I started to go out and speak to a lot of community groups, and I met a lot of people around the country who had been impacted by addiction, including a lot of people who'd lost their children. I was lucky. My son almost died, but he didn't. I was very lucky. But a lot of these people weren't lucky. And I would meet many, many people after a talk, for instance, on a book signing, and people told me their stories, and it was so, so sad and so overwhelming. And I used to come home from that really depressed and really, my wife, I said that, I said, God, I'm feeling so bad. And she said, well, maybe it's because you've just been talking to all these people whose children have died. And of course she was right. And in the middle of this process with Jarvis, because of his stories about the way that he connected with people on the inside of prison and on the outside, and he described this idea of that it's not something he was doing for them, but it was something that they were giving to him. All of a sudden, I went to the next event, and there was this long line of people, and I was looking at them, and everything shifted because I started to realize, no, they were giving me a gift. They were giving me a gift by opening up their hearts and souls and telling me their stories and sharing their grief and crying and hugging. And it was this beautiful thing. And it changed that experience for me completely. I was able to be present. I realized before that I had this big wall between me and everybody just because I was trying not to feel so much pain and absorb it. So that might be the way that it impacted me more than anything. And it really has impacted me in a very, very significant way. And Jarvis is becoming, besides all this, just like with you, Rebecca, and Jarvis has become part of my family. My wife has gone with me to visit him. Karen, my son Jasper's gone to visit him. He and Jasper communicate. They write each other letters. I mean, there's somebody's story that another friend of his, whose name is Lee Lesser, Jarvis happened to call her on the prison phone one day, and she was having a Passover Seder at her house. And she tells the story of Jarvis. She said, "Oh, Jarvis, I'm having a Seder." And she says, "Oh, Jarvis says, oh, I'm so sorry to bother you. I'll call you another time." And she said, no, stay and enjoy the Seder with me. And she put it on speakerphone, and Jarvis spent, the next half hour and a couple phone calls being with those people. And he said it was just like being with her family too. I think that we all feel pretty fortunate about that.
That's so amazing, because at Passover, you leave the doors open for the prophet to wander in, the sense of inviting in the unknown, and to have Jarvis kind of crash the party is so perfect. He has a real knack, and he's called me when I'm hiking, and I'll describe as vividly as I can what I'm seeing and doing. He's called when I'm with other people, from little kids to friends and family members, my partner's family members. And so they've really connected to him. And, and you tell a story, I don't know if I should tell it or you should tell it, about when Trump issued the Muslim ban and we all flocked to the airports around the country to protest, including Elizabeth Warren and John Lewis and things on the East Coast. I was at San Francisco airport, and Jarvis called, and I put him on speakerphone. And it's kind of what you said about the traffic, that I think because he's so deprived sensorially in some ways, when something happens, he has such a deep capacity to experience it. I think also the Buddhist practice has made him be really present. But afterwards, he got to listen to all the people chanting, and I was describing the scenes to him and stuff of people blockading and things like that. And I think you talked to him afterwards too. But I always had this feeling that Jarvis was more present than I was, even though I was there in person and he was just on speakerphone. But he's gone a lot of places with me.
Yeah, I was going to say, of that experience, he said that it was the first time in his life that he was able to participate in our democracy. And it was so meaningful to him. And when he talked about it, he was very emotional about it. And it's, again, he has a life that is inconceivably hard to be where he is. But he's found ways to find joy and, find freedom as he describes it. Jarvis!
Hey, Dave. Hey, how you doing?
Oh, man, we've been waiting for you. Listen, we're so sorry. I was just going to tell you, I'm here with Rebecca and Powell's bookstore up in Portland, and we've got hundreds of people sitting here with us all over who are here, and we've been talking about you for this whole time and hoping that you could call in. And so I'm going to put the phone up to the speaker and the microphone on the computer and I'll let Rebecca say hi.
Jarvis, how you doing?
Hey, how you doing? How you doing, Rebecca? I'm doing okay.
This has been so funny. I was saying that it's like David and I are the warm-up act, that we thought we were going to play 3 songs and then the main act would come on. And like we've done at least 11 songs so far, hoping that they would let you have the phone and call us. So it's good to hear from you because you're our friend. It's also good because there's 196 other people here. And so where should we go? What do you want to say?
I don't know. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to feel like I'm, up on one of those little tiny screens.
We have a nice picture of you up.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Glad to be here. So, how long you guys been talking?
Oh, about
Forever,
right? Or an hour.
a lot of people probably think.
Yeah. Hey, Jarvis, maybe if just to start, you can just talk about what's going on in there, because we were talking earlier about that you were sick, and we're so grateful, of course, that you're better now. But you've experienced, everyone in the world is experiencing this COVID thing, but you and your, the people with whom you live have had it pretty bad.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's like it's been, whenever you get an institution, no matter how big or small it is, and you got more than 2,000 cases of this virus, and it's going around, it's pretty life-threatening, and no one knows when they're going to catch it, So I know there was a person who died yesterday, and there was a guard who died the same day. It's still around, and it's scary, but I had it, and I went through 15 days or 16 days of it, and it was very, very painful. I got it early, so San Quentin did not have any problems with looking at what I was going through and adjusting to that. But at some point, when it got to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, they couldn't control it. It went off the chart. A lot of that still goes on today. So basically, we're trying to live through it, And I always tell guys who's asking me, just let it go through you. Don't try to think you're not gonna get it. Accept the fact that might be the possibility, and no one's going to stop it from going where it's going. So yeah, so I'm glad to be safe and free from the disease. So yeah, but again, there's a lot of other people who have it too. And I think about the families of the people who have contracted this disease and those who have died, and so too with the guard, the sergeant. I felt really, really saddened by his death and his family and what they're going through. I think right now everyone knows that it's not, it cannot get me attitude. I think we're all aware of that now, and including the guards. So today it's been real quiet because everyone's administration has, they've taken some time out for the guard who passed away yesterday, and I guess there's a mourning going on right now, and I feel like I'm a part of that. Just by being.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
So that's it.
Well, definitely glad you're feeling better, and what a nightmare in there, especially since from what we've all read that it could have been prevented, and it was just appalling what happened.
Oh, no doubt about it. It could have been prevented, and I think that's what got a lot of people upset, and especially the guards. And I think what happened with this sergeant guy and passing away yesterday is going to really, really mobilize them to really ask the real questions and get the answers. Who did it, why they did it, and for what reason they did it for. Those questions haven't been answered, So it shouldn't have happened, and it's painful for me to just know that it happened at a time, in a way that just don't make no sense at all. So I just hope the families out there and who are trying to get in touch with their loved ones, somehow they reconnect and let everyone know that they're doing fine. I know I have. So
we've been talking about a lot of different things. We talked about your case, and we've talked about your childhood some, and we talked about your experience since you've been there, and your Buddhism when that began when you met Melody. I wonder if you feel okay about just talking a little bit about it. I know it's a lot to ask because it's been such a sort of a remarkable journey that's taken place over so many years. But how, when you did meet Melody and she turned you on to these Buddhist ideas originally, I know you were very resistant. You weren't interested at all. But sort of what shifted?
What shifted in terms of me starting to look at the masculinity side of being in prison. I think what happened was that Melody. I think what happened was Melody had got into had suffered some kind of injury on her ankle, and she said what she was going to start doing was meditate, and she had a Zen teacher, and I started to trust Melody at that time, and I wanted to go where she went, so I hooked her down, stayed around, and she showed me the various things that she was doing, and I tried it, and it went on from there, so, she really thought the writer out of me, and I really appreciate her, she's still in my life, and I still love her to death.
David, the sound is coming and going. I don't know if the phone is moving or something, but if you can keep it there. But yeah, Jarvis, people come in to do something specific with you and they sort of never leave. You're your own sort of love incarceration system. There's Melody 30-something years later. Here's David. Here's me. There's Pamela. You keep us all. But in something that's really kind of lovely. Did you hear that? Okay, we can't hear him, David.
Oh. Jarvis, for some reason, can you? I'm not sure if there's a problem with the prison phone, but can you try again? Say something. I'm just not sure if anybody can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Rebecca?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
All right.
Cool. Yeah. So I'm totally blessed. I have you, Rebecca, and David, and Melody, and Marty, and Cookie. I have so many people, Connie. There's so many people that I have in my life that I'm blessed by. So yeah, for sure.
Well, lucky us. Lucky us. Just listening to you talk about COVID in the prison is so interesting because there's a way I think a lot of people were like, well, who cares if the prisoners get it? But it's kind of there's a horrible way COVID is a Buddhist teacher. Everything is connected. And the idea that somehow it would impact prisoners without impacting guards, without impacting the community, without impacting the whole Bay Area medical system, was at best a mistake.
Well, are you saying? Well, I think they thought that prisoners were, not as concerning as the general public. And,
yeah.
What happens is that they don't see these guys going home. 5 at a time, 10 at a time, 15 at a time, being paroled, and those people are going right into those low-income communities.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And it can do havoc. These communities are, these communities are with very, very serious medical issues, underlying medical conditions. And I'm very concerned about that. Right? I've said that for months now. But I think San Quentin is, I think San Quentin's in a lot of trouble, So, yeah.
I'm gonna. Jarvis and I were talked to Scott Simon of Weekend Edition on NPR this weekend, and the very last question, Jarvis, I'm going to hit you up with it again. I hope you don't mind. But what he did was Scott said at the very end of the interview, he said, "This is the last question that I ever thought I'd be asking someone on death row, but it just popped into my head, and I hope it's okay that I'm asking you." And he asked Jarvis. He said, "Jarvis, are you happy?"
Yeah, and I basically said you have to compare it to someone, and when I look at my own situation and what I'm going through, and the kind of legal team I have now, and I know how to look out and see what people have and what they don't have. Sure, I'm happy. Yeah, I'm blessed. Yeah, it's just and I know a lot of people can't really get that. How can you be happy on death row and you're innocent and all that? Well, you be around enough people in your life and you see how terrible their lives are and the things that they suffer with, and you just have to say, well, I don't have all that. I'm on death row and I have all these other things, but I don't have the pain that a lot of people are going through. And I think about all these people who are dying from this COVID. There's tons of suffering out there, and I would never want to be someone's son of someone who I can't, touch because he is affected and he's dying. I hold that thought for long enough, and I say, you know what? I am truly lucky that I don't have that. I don't have to have that experience. So yes, I am very, very happy in that regard.
Jarvis, have you read the book? Have you read David? Is he still there?
Yep. Jarvis?
Yeah, I'm here.
I was going to ask if you've read David's book. Well, you must have, because I bet you demanded approval.
No, of course I read David's book. Yeah, it's going out, dog. A lot of people's reading it. I got to know what they're reading. Yeah, for sure. I read it several times, and I love it. It's a good book. There's some things in there that I don't feel like it's embarrassing. It's not, it has nothing to do with the truth. It's just embarrassing. And whenever someone writes about you, you always think that they should say this too, but read this right.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
I was totally grateful in how you wrote the book, and there's no doubt that I'm going to read it about another 1,500 times. But it's just, yeah, I really respect it and appreciate his treatment to my family and how he was able to articulate just the layers of my life that I went through to get to the point I am now. That was where I really, really saw the friend that David is to me. Yeah, so I'm happy for that too.
Yeah, I told I said it before, but I feel like we went from being journalist and subject to being friends and family, and I feel really grateful for your trust.
I remember I don't know if this is too personal a question, but you once said to me, David found out things about your family that you didn't know, and I wonder what those things were.
I think he found out, for example, he found out the depth of what my mother was going through at the time that I had not known. I think he found out, about a lot more about my siblings. My father, I think he found out a lot more about that. Um, I think he found some things about my education too, because I think I had got a scholarship and I threw it away while I was offered a scholarship. And David found out more about that I had no idea about, and he found out some childhood things when I was a teenager that I didn't find out. But yeah. So I mean, I think what he also did was he articulated all those things into seeing one person, and that was what I really stuck to. I saw the way he did that. Because in his book, I mean, in my book, you can always see two or three types of people. Three different Jarvises, and I think what David did was he brought them all together, and that was something that I really, really appreciated.
You just mentioned when you just mentioned your opportunity to go to college after you got out of youth authority. The part you didn't mention is that you had finally, after all this years and all this work, gotten a high school diploma, and you ended up trading it with somebody for a saxophone.
Yeah, that was just to get it out. I was just to get it out my way and pick up something that I had no idea. That saxophone was just like I didn't know how to play it, and I didn't know what I was doing. So I thought, now in retrospect, it was just something that I grabbed, I went for. But the deeper than that was I didn't want to have a high school diploma. I thought that it was not going to do well for me when I moved back down to Los Angeles. So I got rid of it.
You mean you wouldn't fit in with a high school diploma?
Yeah.
With the people you were going to be around?
With a high school diploma?
Yeah. Is that what you're saying?
No, I know. I just knew that, who gave a damn about a high school diploma where I was going? It was being in the streets. It was living in the streets. It was not where, a high school diploma really meant anything to anyone. So, yeah, that's the reason why, Rebecca. I just thought that.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Yeah, I knew I was making a mistake, too. That's a fact. I knew it was a mistake. There was no doubt in my mind it was a mistake. Yeah, so that's why, Rebecca.
Okay. And it didn't mean you hadn't graduated from high school just because you got rid of the diploma, so it was a good deal. God, I didn't know that story. Did I miss it in the book?
The other one, Jarvis, that's related to that, I guess, I don't know if you feel like telling it, is when you were living, I think, in Harbor City, you talked about going up to hang out on the UCLA campus?
Yeah.
And making a fake book? Do you mind telling that one?
Yeah. When I was way out of control and I was taking people's things and I was just out of control, I always went to UCLA and I would always sit out there and watch these kids on their bicycles go back and forth and back and forth. And it was just sometimes where I would just watch myself if I had that opportunity again. I don't know what brought me there. It was just this environment of education that I was just wanting to get close to again. Well, so I started going into these big old university classrooms, and I started being not picked out, but people would ask me, I look at me as if I really belong here and everything. So what I did was I went to I know a lot of your viewers don't know and you can't remember anything about phone booth, but I went to this phone booth. It's funny you even say a phone booth. I went to this phone booth and I got one of those big old telephone books and I ripped it off and I made myself pretend like these were the books that I was going to school with so no one would mess with me. And I did that for a long time. Well, not a long time, but for months. And that was just my little secret hideaway where, all the guys that I grew up with, they would never guess where I was, So, and I didn't write about that story because it was just so in your face, about who you are and what you did, The two opposites just didn't really, it was just, it was how do you get out of this, So yeah, that's that story.
Sounds like you wanted to go to college.
I absolutely, but I wanted to be a part of the conversation in college,
Yeah.
Ask those questions, and I wanted to hear the answer of people who you look and you see him arguing with a professor, and I guess his education gave him the power to make an argument. And I always drew from that, if you're going to argue with these people, you better know what you're talking about. And I used to love watching the debates. I mean, it was unreal to me, And, so that was just, I would walk out with all those kids and I would just feel like I learned a whole bunch, But it didn't matter. It was never relevant where, back in Harbor City and San Pedro and Long Beach where, where I was, where I was going to drive back to. So it was just one of those areas where, no one knew where I was and I wanted to be where I thought I would be thinking a lot about something. So, yeah, I wish I would have wrote about that.
You can still write about it.
Just talking about that story right now just gave me a lot of reasons to write about it because it's a story that I can talk about, but just sitting here thinking about it right now, there's a lot of other stuff there that just came up for me. And you're right, Rebecca, I should write these stories. I might do that. So that's the story, though, David.
Awesome. Did you, sorry, I was waiting for you, Rebecca, but can you, Jarvis, maybe just talk a little bit about your practice now and really what, meditation in Buddhism has meant to you? I mean, we talked about it very, very generally, but, from your own experience, I know you had to come a long way before you even would consider sitting, as you told me when Melody told you you had to sit and breathe and on the floor to meditate, you said, in prison you do not sit, you do not close your eyes. You're always looking out for danger. But obviously you ended up doing that. And how would you describe, what it's like and how has it, impacted your time in San Quentin?
Well, yeah, I've come a long, long way in my Buddhist practice, and I used to try to just sit there, and I was scared, I wasn't into closing my eyes, that was a big commitment, even in the cell that was locked, so that's where I started from, that kind of, from that age, and then I started, like I said, I started looking at what was it about me that I just couldn't get rid of, and that was that thick skin. That was those mattresses that I made sure that if I fall, I had something to cushion me on. And by that means, I can always
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
I could always revert back to being who I thought I was. But reading these books that Melody started sharing with me just really, really gave me a different. It didn't tell me to change. It just said the book said, there's something for you to tap into. And I would sit there trying to tap into those things and be motivated by the books I was reading. And then at some point, I was introduced to Buddhism. And that was a whole nother chapter of my life. I ended up having me a great, great teacher, Shangdu Rinpoche, and I had a community that would constantly share information, send me transcripts of some of his talks, and I really found myself knowing how to be a Buddhist and be in San Quentin at the same time, which is a whole other world, whole other way of doing that. I didn't go to the temple. I went out to the exercise yard, I knew that, these exercise yards were armed, So how do I, become a practitioner in a place like this was just, it was a lot of maneuvering. It was hanging out with the right people, sharing things like haikus, that people would write that would give them the reason for why their own creativity could be closer to some kind of spiritual, activity or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, it was hard. It was really hard, and I got through that. And it taught me how other people can get through it too. So yeah, it was, and then later on, my practice became more deeper because I met Pema, and I met Alice Anaki, and I met just, a ray of towards Buddhism, and that really kind of, it really grounded me. It really grounded me. It grounded me in a way where I can reach for things and learn more. And a lot of people don't have that here, They don't have no one they can ask to send them a book, and that book will be sent to them. So I was truly with opportunities that a lot of people did not have in prison, and you notice them. They're there every day, I talk to you about the mail. I would get tons of mail, and no one around me would get one letter. You know how to say, people care about me. People really, really want.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
And, again, I can say it 1,000 times, but there's so much that I can appreciate from people. Friends, loved ones. So, yeah.
Well, you're going to get cut off, it sounds like, in a minute or something, but, I just want to say how great it is to talk to you again, and I miss you. As soon as COVID's over, we can have visits again.
Thank you, Jarvis. Give me a call soon.
I might be out before then.
Yeah.
Say again?
That was Rebecca saying, give her a call and thank you.
She said caller?
Yeah.
When you've got a moment, I'm always here.
I know you are, Rebecca, and I love you so much.
Those are some closing words.
I was going to say, that's, I'm so glad Jarvis got to talk for at least a while. That was
maybe Powell connected this, so it's mostly there's a lot more Jarvis and a lot less of us. I guess it's really time to go now. Thank you, Powells. Thank you, David. Thank you, 106 listeners who hung on out. I salute your steadfastness, and most of all, thank you, Jarvis.
Thank you.
On behalf of Powell's, thank you all for joining us for this evening's event. It was such a pleasure to host you, David and Rebecca and Jarvis. Please consider picking up a copy of David's book on Powells.com, and we look forward to seeing you at another digital event very soon. David, Rebecca, and Jarvis, thank you so much again. We're so grateful. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.